In today's video, I'm going to be analyzing SciShow's video about whether science proves that there are more than two human sexes, which you can see here. We're going to be analyzing this video, giving you our thoughts about it.
In high school biology, we usually learn that the sexes in humans are fixed and concrete. Whether you're male or female is black and white and rooted in your DNA. Your 23rd pair of chromosomes is either two X chromosomes or an X and a Y. That's it. End of story. And that's essentially what scientists thought too. But it turns out that sex isn't that straightforward. In fact, biologists today are saying sex is a spectrum, and the scientific community is still working on understanding and respecting the people who fall in the middle of that spectrum. To get this
Now, before we get started, I do like to note that it's important to agree with the idea that XY and XX is just a binary or a dichotomy, which isn't exactly correct. There are a growing phenomenon of intersex. I think a lot of the debate right now, when it goes into whether sex is a binary, a spectrum, or something in between those two ideas, does not come down to whether there are XY chromosomes, what are the chromosomes, what are the nature of those chromosomes, but it is more so about what are we meant to do with that data, what are we meant to do with that information. When someone is of an intersex nature, does that then prove that it's a spectrum, or does it just prove that there might be another category out there that we have to include? Or when there is that differences, are these differences something which is of note to the idea of sex being a binary, or is it just an anomaly or something which is of a small percentile, which, although has to be noted, should not be seen as something which goes against the common situation? For example, in science or just in life in general, there's always anomalies which happen. And something in science as well, which is often taught, is that when anomalies do arise, while you should take note of it, it doesn't mean that that anomaly would then have an impact on the rest of the entire spectrum or the rest of the entirety of research. So there is a lot of questions just from the beginning part, which I'll just like to flag up just to start with. Let's carry on with the video.
out of the way right up front, we're not talking about gender or sexuality here. Gender refers to social and cultural attributes and understandings of men and women and their roles, though not every culture has only two categories, and it's increasingly seen as a spectrum. Plus, the gender you identify as may or may not be the same one as what you express with things like your clothing and behavior, all of which can also be on a spectrum. Sexuality describes who you are attracted to, and it can be equally complicated and on a spectrum, and where you are on these spectrums isn't necessarily fixed. What we are talking about today is your biology. And
I think this is a very important distinction to have when we're talking about sex and gender, when a lot of the conservatives and the liberals and all whoever are out there discussing and debating in a very heated fashion, pointing to this guy saying, oh, you're a bigot, oh, you're not a bigot, what not. And a lot of times we look at this and we're like, actually, the reality is you're just confusing the two together. What one person is saying, oh, I'm defending the traditional scientific percentage of the two sexes, that's actually different from what someone else is saying, well, I'm actually supporting the gender spectrum, or I'm supporting the sexuality spectrum. There's a lot of different nuances to it. And it's very important when we're discussing the issue that we don't equivocate on any of our arguments, that we don't equivocate on any of our ideas. So that's just something to keep in mind when we are indeed approaching this topic. Let's carry on.
Including your chromosomes, your hormones, your gonads, and your genitals. The catch is that these biological features don't always agree with each other. And they certainly don't always conform to those high school health class diagrams that tell us there's a single, universally correct pathway to being male and female. In fact, it's estimated that nearly 2% of live births are born with congenital conditions of atypical sex development.
Now, before we carry on with that, this statistic that they have, let me go back a few seconds just so that that statistic is on the board. I think it is something which is true. A lot of people are born with what people call DSDs or intersex or whatever you want to call that phenomena. The name of that phenomena has changed in scientific literature over time just to be a bit more inclusive. In the past, they called it disorders. Now they're trying to change it to differences and other more inclusive and more less negative words to describe those situations, that 2%. However, when you're talking about that 2%, I think it was actually close to 1.8 the last time I looked at it. But the reality is that 2% is representing a very large group of people which is classified into that situation, many of which would actually fall into closer to a male or closer to a female side. For example, what he talked about is like your gonads, your hormones, your chromosomes, all of those put up or present a certain masculine sex or a female sex. However, what you do notice is that a lot of those 2% would actually be, most of those features would be male, and only a very few percentage would be female. So as a result, when we're thinking about this situation, it's very important to note that while 2% may seem like a very big number, you also have to look at exactly what is in that 2% to see where on that spectrum between male and female, or where do they lie between male and female, are they? And what implications does that have? And what I'm trying to present you and I'm trying to explain here is something called the philosophy of science, the meta-science ideas of, well, we have some data here. How do we draw a conclusion? And how do we draw a conclusion at times is just as, if not more important than analyzing, well, what actually is the data, because a lot of people will agree with the data. If you're enjoying this video so far, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think are the ways we should draw the information and what conclusions we should draw from this discussion? Let's carry on.
Births are born with congenital conditions of atypical sex development. That basically means that something in their chromosomes, hormones, gonads, or genitals is different from what many people expect of a boy or a girl.
That's actually incorrect in the sense that a lot of that 2% is that maybe the chromosomes, hormones, gonads, genitals, maybe 3 of them are of a boy or 3 of them are of a girl. So it's, while it might seem like when they're presenting this, it's like 2 of them are boy, 2 of them are girl. Actually, a lot of them is way closer to boy and girl. And it's only in rare circumstances, an even smaller amount of that 2%, which it's generally a 50-50 split. And even then, it's very difficult to say it's a 50-50 split. And one could also say, to affirm the idea of a male situation and a female situation, or a set of chromosomes, hormones, gonads, and genitals, is to affirm that the binary does exist and that people would then tend to veer away from it, just in the same way that people tend perhaps have different skin colors or different areas around the world, but doesn't change the fact that Asia as a continent and as a people still exists, and America as a people and as a continent still exists, even though some people would be further or closer away to South America than maybe Alaska or another area. But at the same time, it doesn't change the fact that those things exist. So this is what I'm talking about by the science and the philosophy of science, is how are we meant to deal with the data? And that's a very important thing to look at.
This used to be known as being intersex, but these days it's better described as having differences of sexual development.
That was what I was referring to previously. Now it's called differences of sexual development. It used to be called disorder or some other more negative words. So as a result, it really depends on how you're terminating. Intersex is also something that they do call as well. And I think it doesn't really matter what you're calling it. It all refers to generally the same thing in the literature.
DSDs. And while nearly 2% might not sound like a lot, it means that there could be 130 million people or more with DSDs. If all those people were in one country, it would be among the top 10 most populous countries in the world. Plus, DSDs are not always something you can see. People can spend their whole lives thinking they're one sex based on anatomy, only to find at least part of them tells a different story. You see, your sex is the result of both sexual determination and sexual differentiation. Sexual determination has to do with what chromosomes you get. Those largely determine what happens to your body during sexual differentiation, the process by which you develop the physiological characteristics associated with your sex. And contrary to what you might think, that differentiation doesn't stop when you're born. It continues throughout your life. And that means there are a lot of moments when differences between people can happen. So of course, there are a ton of different outcomes. We tend to put these outcomes into 2 boxes based on visible anatomy, or what scientists call phenotypes. Phenotypical males have testicles and a penis, while phenotypical females have ovaries, a uterus, a vagina, and vulva. But in reality, none of the traits we use to discriminate between the sexes are truly binary. There's a lot of variation within what we call male or female, and there's a lot of overlap that's normal too. Anatomically, someone might look phenotypically female on the outside, but not have ovaries or a uterus, or have tissues from both ovaries and testes. And genetics aren't any clearer, because when it comes comes to chromosomes, people don't always just get two X's or an X and a Y. X's and Y's contain genes that help determine sex, with the Y chromosome conferring the genes that enable you to develop male reproductive parts. But the processes for producing sperm and eggs are really complicated, and they can lead to lots of different results. In this process, abbreviated version, specialized...
Before we carry on with this, I do like to raise a few pointers, I think, of significant note. The first thing is that when a lot of people are presenting the issue, they like to say, well, all right, there's a lot of overlap between male and female, therefore it must be a spectrum. That is not correct. I do not agree with that form of a philosophy of science or that conclusion they get from the evidence. Just that there's a lot of overlap doesn't mean it's a spectrum at all. In fact, a good example of this would be if you look at our closest animal counterpart, I think it's chimpanzees or something along those lines. I forgot exactly which one it is. It's been a long time since I looked at the data. But if you look at the genetic code of those animals and compare it to human animals, there's like a 99% overlap there. So the overlap between male and female, even if there is an overlap, doesn't mean that those binaries don't exist in the same way that you could look at a human and look at a chimpanzee or a closest relative animal and say, well, all right, there are a difference between them, and it's quite clear that this is a human and that's not a human. You know, it's like, even though there's so much overlap, and that overlap is significantly greater than the overlap that we see here with sex, those small difference, that 2% makes all the difference. So as a result, when we're talking about overlap and say, well, all right, there's an overlap, hence spectrum, hence no binary, I would say that leap is unwarranted just because overlap does not lead to no binary. That is an unwarranted leap, given how overlaps and those commonalities work in the wider field of biology. So it's very important when we're talking about these issues that we're not only just going to look at, okay, let's just only look at the differentiations of sex for this topic, that we also look at our overall methodology when it comes to science, because we cannot, and I think it's a very dangerous thing, is to say that we have a certain conclusion that we want to reach. Either it's the extreme conservatives saying, oh, I need to have all my evidence supporting binary, so no matter what, I don't care about how other people are doing science elsewhere. I don't care about what the implications of my methodology about sex would imply on anything else. I'm just going to force my views and adopt a methodology which only works for my situation here. In the same way, if you're an extreme liberal or perhaps want to suggest sex is a spectrum, well, all right, they might just accept everything and say, well, all right, let's have a methodology which supports my conclusion only in this situation. Well, that's a very dangerous thing to do, because then it just leads to ad hocness and also just does not show how science has to be done, which is I accept a methodology which can be applicable across a lot of different situations. That's how you get an objectivity to science, not a subjective situation according to each individual specific instance. So as a result, it's very important that when we're looking at this, we're not just saying, okay, this methodology seems to work here to suggest sex is a spectrum, therefore sex is a spectrum. You have to say, well, if I'm going to use that methodology, what conclusion would I have with other parts of science? Does that then mean that I'm actually a chimpanzee now? Does it mean that my sister is more of a chimpanzee than I am? Does that mean the spectrum between me and a chimpanzee is such that there are no longer any distinction between chimpanzee and humans? Does it mean that maybe I might be a bit more of a banana because a banana shares quite a lot of codes with me? That's, of course, questions which would raise as a result of that discussion. Let's carry on with the video.
Cells basically duplicate themselves, then undergo 2 rounds of division to produce reproductive cells, or gametes, that have half of the parent's genetic material. So it makes one set of 23 chromosomes. But sometimes the chromosomes don't split into exact sets of 23, and that means there are a whole bunch of possible combinations of X's and Y's that a person can end up with. For instance, people can inherit 3 X's or an X and 2 Y's. These folks are normally taller than average. Those with 3 X's have slender builds and sometimes have minor learning disorders. The people who have an X and 2 Y's, on the other hand, tend to have more acne because of the extra testosterone in their systems. In both cases, people retain full fertility. Then there's Turner syndrome, which happens when you just get 1 X. That results in female characteristics, but the people who have it tend to be shorter, don't really go through puberty, and may have mental disabilities and are sterile. And Klinefelter syndrome, which results from two X's and a Y, is the most common chromosomal sex anomaly. It happens in 1 in 600 male births and can cause lower testosterone production and cause incomplete testicular development, though the symptoms can be minor enough that a person isn't diagnosed until later in life. Now, there's also the fact that all your cells in your body don't necessarily have the same chromosomal makeup, which, like, what? Did I learn nothing but lies in high school? But it's true. Someone with mosaicism can develop from a single fertilized egg but have a patchwork of genetically different cells. And someone who's a genetic chimera has different cells because they develop from two different fertilized eggs that merge in the womb. In both cases, it's possible to end up with a mix of cells with different sex chromosomes. And depending on the distribution of those cells, mosaicism and chimerism can result in ambiguous sexual characteristics or both male and female reproductive body parts. It's even been shown that pregnant people and their fetuses frequently swap stem cells through the placenta in a phenomenon known as microchimerism. That means a chromosomal female can be carrying around XY cells, and her son can have XX ones. In some studies, these cells have been shown to stick around in the mother for several decades. But all that said, there are also plenty of people with double X or XY chromosomes that also have differences of sexual development. That's in part because at least 25 genes play a role in sex differentiation. So both mutations and relocations of these genes can result in a range of differences.
That is definitely very true, and I think it's very important to note that there are a lot of things going on in sex differentiation and sex determination processes. It's not a very simple distinction and discussion going on. I actually have a book where I write a lot about these issues, not just about transgender or the sex issue, but I also talk about other key philosophical issues in my book, Christianity for All. Link to that is in the description below, so you can check it out on Amazon. Or you can check it out on Amazon there. It is definitely something which is important, and something which is important to note is that a lot of times these discussions are way more complex than what people present. It's not as simple as, oh, XX chromosome, I'm going to bash you over the head, you are a male or a female now. Oh yeah, that's exactly the way it is. There are a lot of differences there, and it's important to note those differences. But at the same time, it's also important to present and analyze the data that we have in an honorable and a just way. And we're not trying to mess the data up with a certain methodology just to help our own studies. You have to have an honest and integral look at all of it. And I think that's what I'm trying to do and trying to present to you. I'm not here to say you have to accept a certain conclusion. That's not my job here to do. I have my views. You have your views. You're entitled to your own views. But at the same time, it's very important that you look at the evidence honestly and say, well, is this what the evidence is pointing to? And does my methodology, which uses the evidence, support the conclusions that I wanted to support? Or would that lead to further ridiculous conclusions down the line? Those are all things which you have to think about when you're approaching this issue, so you treat the issue fairly and justly. If you've been enjoying this video so far and have found it helpful, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. If you want to support this channel financially and support our mission, then check out our Patreon in the link below, where you can support our channel there as well. Hope you enjoyed this video, and let's carry on.
Necessary for male development can be swapped onto the X chromosome, for example, or someone can end up with multiple or mutated versions of other sex-determining genes. And some of these are on other chromosomes and are inherited as run-of-the-mill recessive traits. All of these genes really start to be influential around 6 weeks of development. You see, at 6 weeks, the fetus has a pair of bulges called the gonadal ridges next to its kidneys, and they have the potential to develop into ovaries or testes. The fetus at this point also has 2 sets of ducts. One set can develop into the uterus and fallopian tubes, while the other set has the potential to become the epididymis, vas deferens, and seminal vesicles. And what happens from there is somewhat of a balancing act of different genes working in concert. Essentially, different networks of genes shout male and female, and when that balance gets knocked slightly askew, it can move a person along the sex spectrum. Take SRY, discovered in the 1990s. This is the male programming trimming gene, and it has a big effect on development. If it ends up on the chromosome of someone who is XX, it can cause them to develop testes instead of ovaries. This can happen because there's a step in sperm and egg production when chromosomes swap some DNA with their partner chromosomes. And even though the X and Y chromosomes generally don't join in on this DNA swapping process, they sometimes do. Plus, other mutations that occur during the production of gametes can result in multiple or mutated versions of SRY or other sex-determining genes because it's not the only gene that matters. There are also genes that actively encourage the fetus to develop female characteristics. For instance, the gene Wnt4 suppresses testicular development and promotes ovarian development, and multiple copies of it can cause incomplete female gonads to develop in people who are XY. Gonad development also triggers the production of sex-specific hormones, which results in further sex-specific development. But some people have differences of sex differentiation that limit their ability to respond to those hormones. Complete androgen insensitivity syndrome is one of these. People who have it are unaffected by male sex hormones because they have some kind of mutation to the protein that these hormones bind to, called the androgen receptor. And that means that while they have testes and a Y chromosome, their exterior genitals appear female or in between. There's also congenital adrenal hyperplasia, the most common DSD out there. That's when the adrenal glands underproduce cortisol and overproduce androgens, the male hormone group that includes testosterone. The underproduction of cortisol can lead to health problems, while the overproduction of androgens can lead to external male genitalia paired with internal female gonads in people with XX chromosomes. Some of these conditions don't fully present themselves until puberty or later. In fact, some aren't realized at all until a person seeks some kind of medical care that reveals them. Like in 2014, doctors reported one case of a 70-year-old father of 4 whose, quote, hernia turned out to be a uterus with fallopian tubes. But in many cases, differences in sexual development are notable from birth. For those newborns, it may be possible to assign a gender based on what they're more likely to identify as they grow up. The thing
Now that's a very interesting point. You can see the small slip of assigning a gender, which is different from assigning a sex, which they kind of slip it in there. And I think that's probably I'll abide by the principle of charity and say that's just an accidental slip of gender into sex. And of course, there's a very common historical connection with the two, and that's very clear. However, what I do think is that it is just very important that we're using the terms correctly, and what he said so far is all well and good. The only thing being is that a lot of these are just extreme exceptions and can, at least to me, under my methodology, and I'm focused on my methodology here, some people would disagree with me, and that's completely fine. But I would say, yes, there are a lot of situations, and it's a very complex idea of what makes someone a male or what makes someone a female. There is no disagreement about that. But to me, I would say in response to this, that all of these are indeed a part of, how would you call it, an anomaly. It's a process which does not carry out based on what would have been the case if the situation carried out perfectly. In the same way that if you're in a lab, and everyone who's done science knows this, is that if you're in a lab, chemistry lab, and you do everything correctly, perfectly, there is no external factors and external variables, the result should repeat 100 times out of 100 and you should get the same thing. However, that's not the world we live in. The world is a bit messy. Things are unpredictable. There might be external variables like factor in heat, factor in temp, like all these different things, right? Oxygen levels, all these things can influence a result or can influence a test. And as a result, if things don't go as planned or by the books, changes in results would happen. Now, if changes in results happen, do those ultimately affect the study that you've made? Does it change or challenge a hypothesis if the framework or if the situation did not match up to what the hypothesis was arguing for? The answer is no. At least under my methodology, and I think it's the most reasonable methodology, I would say no. If a certain process is meant to go from A to B to C, and goes from A to D to C instead, or A to D to E, I would say, well, all right, if that A, D, and E process is a differentiation factor and was not the original intended way in which things are meant to be working, then you have to separate that as an anomaly or as a mistake or as something which went on differently to what the normal process is and should not be regarded in the same pool of evidence as when things go from A to B to C as they should be. Now, of course, I'm trying to avoid to use any negative language here just to kind of be inclusive and be open to everyone. However, that is what the framework that I'm proposing should be the correct way to look at these differences. Are there differences? Yes, but that is a result of an A to D to E instead of an A to B to C.
Is with all of the things that can happen during sexual development, when a child is born with an obvious difference of sex development, it's not always clear why. Looking at chromosomes often isn't enough, and sometimes a hormonal test isn't either. And even if the child's doctors have a sense of what's going on, determining what, if any, treatment is necessary can be challenging.
Now, this, of course, takes the development and the debate even further beyond whether sex is a binary or not, or whether there are more than two human sexes, which is the title of the video. I think we will end the video there just because I think the treatment of these things is a completely different debate, which is a very complex one, which I don't think we should go into today. Now, what can we take away from this video? What can we take away from this analysis? Well, I think there's a few things that can be taken away from this analysis. Firstly, I would say the idea that science proves that there are more than two human sexes is incorrect. That is not necessarily a conclusion that you have to guarantee or result in from the evidence provided, as I've argued before. The reality is that just that there are an A, D, and E process does not mean there are more than two human sexes, just as that if a certain scientific experiment goes wrong and there's external variables which change the situation, it does not then lead to suggest that when you're combining magnesium with water, then flames would be produced. Just that you change the experiment a bit or some external factor changes it, it does not then mean that there is an extra result to the variable or the science experiment. It just means that there was a change involved there, and you just should pay attention to the fact that there are differences given certain changes. So that's my approach to this entire issue of intersex, the science, and all that is related. So that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. And if you think it's helpful, share it with your friends. And if you want to support our channel and our mission financially, then go check us out on Patreon for exclusive benefits over there. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you in the next one.